Welcome to this deep dive into the metaphysical world. You guys have sent us quite a collection of materials on the intersection of faith, the supernatural, and even a dash of folklore.
Yes, it's quite the intriguing mix.
It is. Our main source for this deep dive is this article titled The Things That Go Bump in the Night, which really dives deep into the question of whether metaphysical beings actually exist.
Hmm.
I'm already hooked by the way it connects vampires to blood purification.
Yeah.
That's not something you see every day. Before we get into vampires, though, it looks like this article kicks things off by exploring the role of belief in the supernatural.
You've hit the nail on the head there.
Okay.
The article argues that accepting the possibility of a supernatural reality is a key difference between what it calls traditionalist and materialist worldviews.
So can you unpack that a bit? What exactly does the article mean by traditionalist?
It's basically a worldview that acknowledges a reality beyond the purely physical, a realm of spirit, the divine, or forces we might not fully understand.
Yeah.
You could say it's the foundation for many religions and spiritual traditions.
Right.
And the article suggests this worldview is in direct conflict with a purely materialist perspective.
Materialism being the idea that everything can be explained by physical processes with no room for the supernatural.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the article frames this clash of worldviews as a defining tension in our modern world.
Right.
It's a conflict that plays out in everything from debates about science and religion to the rise of secularism versus the persistence of faith.
It definitely feels relevant to a lot of the cultural conversations happening today.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if this traditionalist worldview is open to the supernatural, does that mean it automatically accepts the idea of miracles?
Well, the article seems to argue that a belief in miracles flows naturally from this worldview.
Okay.
However, it acknowledges that modern society, with its emphasis on scientific explanation, often struggles to accept events that defy our current understanding.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like our default mode is to look for a rational scientific explanation. Mm-hmm.
But then the article throws in these examples of things like scented oil flowing from Orthodox icons and a Bible.
Right.
Do you think those events could be considered miracles?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
It's certainly tempting to view these occurrences as evidence of the divine.
Yeah.
The challenge, of course, lies in discerning genuine experiences from hoaxes or natural phenomena that we might not fully comprehend.
Right. You have to approach these claims with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right.
But at the same time, if we shut down the possibility of anything beyond our current understanding, we might miss out on something truly extraordinary.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance, being discerning, but also open to the possibility that there's more to reality than meets the eye.
So if we're entertaining the idea of the supernatural, where do angels and demons fit into all of this? Are they just characters and stories, or could they be real entities?
The article affirms the existence of both angels and demons.
Okay.
Pretty standard figures in traditional Christian belief.
But then it goes a step further and presents a rather fascinating theory about demons.
Oh, do tell.
Well, it suggests that demons are actually the disembodied souls of the Nephilim.
Okay, now you've lost me.
Oh.
Who are the Nephilim? Is this something from the Bible?
Yes, they're mentioned in the book of Genesis
Okay.
and also pop up in other ancient texts.
Okay.
Think of them as these powerful beings born from the union of fallen angels and human women.
Okay.
Their existence was considered a violation of the natural order, a transgression against God's plan.
Wow, so they were kind of like these forbidden hybrids.
Exactly.
That's a pretty intense origin story.
It is.
But how does that connect to them becoming demons?
The article suggests that because the Nephilim were born outside of God's intended creation, their souls don't have a designated place in the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
They're these spiritual refugees, if you will.
Okay.
And that's what ultimately leads them to become demons.
That's a pretty mind-blowing concept, isn't it? It makes you wonder if the origins of evil are much more complex than we often imagine.
Absolutely.
It also ties back to the conflict between the traditionalist and materialist worldviews.
Absolutely. The very notion of beings like angels and demons, and especially the Nephilim, challenges a purely materialist understanding of reality.
So, if we accept for a moment that these beings might exist, where do they reside?
Right.
Is there some sort of invisible realm where they operate?
That's where the article gets really interesting.
Okay.
It presents this idea of the metaphysical realm as a higher dimension, a realm beyond our everyday perception.
Okay, hold on. We're talking about dimensions now.
Yeah.
Are we about to dive into string theory and the multiverse? Because I am so here for that.
Perhaps not string theory. But the article is definitely tapping into this idea that reality is far vaster and more complex than our limited senses can perceive.
So it's not necessarily a physical place, this higher dimension?
Not in the way we typically understand physical. The article suggests it's more of a different state of being,
Okay.
a level of reality that transcends our everyday experience, but which nonetheless can influence our world.
So kind of like how gravity is this invisible force that shapes the universe even though we can't see it?
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
The article seems to suggest that these metaphysical beings and forces might operate on a similar principle influencing our world from a realm beyond our direct perception. And you know it's really fascinating.
What?
Science and philosophy have grappled with similar concepts for centuries.
Oh, like how?
Well, take the concept of multiple dimensions.
Okay.
Physics has explored this idea extensively,
Yeah.
suggesting that there might be dimensions beyond the three spatial dimensions and one time dimension we experience.
Right.
And philosophers have long debated the nature of reality and the limitations of human perception.
So this idea of a higher metaphysical dimension isn't just some woo spiritual concept.
Not at all.
There might actually be scientific and philosophical frameworks that support it.
Exactly. And that's what makes this exploration so exciting. It's where science, philosophy, and spirituality converge, and where the boundaries of what we think we know about reality start to blur.
All right, I'm officially hooked.
Good.
But before we get too lost in the theoretical, let's get back to those creatures that go bump in the night.
Go.
And I think it's time to tackle the one that's captivated imaginations for centuries. The vampire.
Ah, yes, the creature of the night. The article takes a fascinating approach to vampires,
Okay.
suggesting there's truth to the myth on both a narrative and archetypal level.
What exactly does that mean? You mean vampires aren't just fictional characters?
Roll.
Could they be?
What? Hold on. It's not quite saying that there are literal blood-sucking creatures lurking in the shadows.
Okay.
But it does suggest that the vampire archetype speaks to something very real about the human experience.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Okay.
Tell me more.
It argues that the vampire, beyond being a creature of darkness, represents the archetypal rapist.
Whoa, hold up. That's a pretty intense comparison.
I know.
Can you explain that a bit further?
It's about the idea of someone feeding off the life force of others, draining their energy and vitality.
Okay.
The vampire, in this sense, becomes a symbol of exploitation, a representation of those who take without giving, who thrive on the depletion of others.
I see where you're going with this.
Okay.
It's a pretty dark interpretation, but it definitely makes you think about the ways in which people can exploit each other, even in the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article even connects this idea to real-world practices in cults and Satanism, where the taking of someone's energy or essence is often a twisted goal.
Okay, now that is a truly disturbing thought.
It is.
It's like the darkness depicted in the vampire myth is reflecting something that exists in real life, something we might not want to acknowledge. But if that's the case, could there be a literal blood-drinking vampire out there? Is that even remotely possible?
That's where we enter the territory of speculation and blurred lines between myth and potential reality.
Because the article does mention accounts of real-life vampires, right?
It does. It even references Peter Thiel having to publicly deny engaging in certain practices associated with vampirism.
Oh, wow. That's where things take a turn toward X-Files territory.
Right.
So how do we even begin to approach these claims?
Yeah.
Is it all just elaborate hoaxes and people caught up in fantasies, or could there be something more to it? I'm looking at you for guidance here.
Well, I think the article encourages us to approach such claims with both a healthy dose of skepticism and an open mind.
Okay.
It's about finding that balance between critical thinking and a willingness to consider possibilities that might initially seem outlandish.
Yeah.
After all, dismissing something outright just because it doesn't fit within our current understanding can sometimes lead to missed opportunities for discovery.
I hear you on that.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, keep an open mind, but not so open, your brain falls out.
Exactly.
So we need to be discerning, but not dismissive. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I want to touch on something else the article mentions about vampires.
And what's that?
Their traditional weaknesses: garlic, silver, sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
It points out that those things actually have blood-purifying properties.
They do.
That's quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?
It's definitely one of those aha moments where ancient wisdom seems to align with modern scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It's as if our ancestors without fully understanding the scientific mechanisms, stumbled upon practical solutions based on observation and experience.
I love that.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other hidden truths might be lurking in these old stories, just waiting to be uncovered.
It does.
It's like they're puzzles or codes, and if we look closely enough, we might find some profound insights.
I think you're onto something there.
Yeah.
There's a certain wisdom embedded in these traditions, a way of seeing the world that we've perhaps lost touch with in our modern scientific age.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
But I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
we have.
We've explored the tension between traditionalist and materialist worldviews, the possibility of miracles,
Right?
the intriguing concept of the Nephilim,
Yes.
and we've even dipped our toes into the murky waters of vampire lore.
Indeed. We've journeyed from the foundations of faith to the shadowy realm of the supernatural.
So for our listeners, take a moment to digest all of this, ponder those lingering questions, and get ready for part 2 where we'll delve even deeper into the meaning and significance of these myths and legends.
Yes.
We might even uncover some more surprising connections between the supernatural and the world we know.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the metaphysical.
It's like we've opened this Pandora's box of ancient myths and legends, and I'm finding it hard to close.
It's certainly captivating, isn't it? And speaking of captivating, our exploration of vampires in the last part seems to have sparked your curiosity.
It definitely has. You know, growing up, I was fascinated by mythology, Greek myths, Norse sagas, all of it. But I always saw them as pure fantasy, like elaborate fairy tales.
And that's a common perspective.
Yeah.
But what if those stories, even the ones with fantastical creatures and seemingly impossible feats, were born from something more than just imagination?
I'm listening.
What if they were our ancestors' attempts to grapple with experiences that defied their understanding,
Ooh.
to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of the world around them in a time when science and reason weren't the dominant forces they are today?
You're suggesting that those ancient myths and legends might actually hold hidden truths, or at least reflections of a deeper reality.
Precisely. And the article we're exploring for you really emphasizes this point.
Okay.
It argues that these stories often contain kernels of wisdom, warnings, and insights into the nature of reality and the forces at play in the universe.
So it's not just about entertainment or escapism.
Not at all. Think about it.
Okay.
Many of these myths deal with universal themes that transcend time and culture, creation, destruction, good versus evil, the struggle between humanity and the divine. These are profound philosophical and spiritual questions that humans have grappled with for millennia.
So you're saying that these stories, even the ones with monsters and magic, were actually ways of exploring those big existential questions. It's like those ancient cultures were trying to make sense of the world around them, and these myths were their way of processing experiences that defied logic or reason.
Exactly. They were trying to understand their place in the cosmos, the nature of life and death, and the forces, both seen and unseen, that shape our lives.
It's almost as if these myths were a form of early psychology or philosophy, a way of dealing with the complexities of existence.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes you wonder why certain myths and creatures have persisted across cultures and throughout history.
Like vampires, for instance.
Right.
They pop up everywhere, from ancient folklore to modern literature and film.
The article makes a compelling argument that the vampire archetype in particular speaks to something deep within the human psyche.
I remember you mentioned this earlier,
Well,
that vampires represent the archetypal rapist. Oh, yeah.
let's unpack that a bit further.
Okay.
What do you think that metaphor reveals about our fears and perhaps even the darker side of human nature?
Well, it's definitely tapping into the fear of exploitation,
Hmm.
of having your energy or life force drained by someone else.
Exactly. It speaks to the potential for abuse of power, for manipulation, and the ways in which people can take advantage of others for their own gain.
And if we connect this back to the real world, the article even cites cults and Satanism as examples where the taking of someone's energy or essence is a disturbing reality.
It's a sobering reminder that the darkness explored in these myths isn't always confined to the realm of fiction.
It's almost like these myths are cautionary tales, warning us about the dangers that lurk both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Precisely. They remind us that while there's beauty and wonder in the world, there are also shadows and forces that can be destructive if we're not careful.
It's interesting, though, how these myths often provide ways to combat those dark forces. like in vampire lore, where garlic, holy water, and sunlight are used to ward off the creatures.
And remember, we discussed how some of those remedies have intriguing connections to real-world practices.
Right. The article pointed out that garlic and silver actually have blood-purifying properties.
It's as if our ancestors stumbled upon practical solutions without fully understanding the scientific basis behind them.
Right.
Almost like intuition or folk wisdom guiding them.
I love that folk wisdom. It speaks to this idea that we might be able to glean valuable insights from these old stories, even if we approach them with a modern scientific lens.
That's the beauty of this exploration, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not about choosing sides between science and mythology. It's about recognizing that both have something valuable to offer.
So what's the takeaway here? Are you suggesting we should start carrying garlic bulbs and crucifixes everywhere we go? I'm only half joking.
Perhaps not literally, but I think the real lesson is to be open to the wisdom embedded in these traditions, to recognize that our ancestors may have had a deeper understanding of the world than we give them credit for.
Right.
And remember, the article itself urges a balance of discernment and open-mindedness.
I'm definitely sensing a theme here.
Yeah.
It seems like this balance between skepticism and open-mindedness is crucial when exploring the metaphysical realm.
Absolutely. It's about acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and being willing to learn from the past, even if it comes in the form of myths and legends.
This conversation has really shifted my perspective.
Good.
I'm starting to see these myths not just as stories, but as reflections of our deepest fears, hopes, and attempts to understand the world around us.
And that's the power of exploring the metaphysical realm.
Yeah.
It challenges our assumptions, expands our awareness, and invites us to consider possibilities that lie beyond the ordinary.
Right.
But we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
Oh.
Are you ready to delve even deeper?
Bring it on. What's next on our metaphysical adventure?
Well, in the next part, we're going to tackle the big question. What if some of these mythical creatures aren't just metaphors, but actually exist?
Okay.
We'll explore the evidence, the arguments, and maybe even venture into some truly spooky territory.
Okay, listeners, if you've made it this far, you're clearly as intrigued by this topic as we are.
Yes.
Get ready for part 3, where we'll dive headfirst into the question of whether these creatures of myth and legend might be more than just figments of our imagination.
It's going to be fascinating.
Stay tuned. Okay, deep divers, we are here, the final part of our deep dive into the metaphysical world. We've explored some fascinating concepts so far, from the power of belief to the potential wisdom hidden in ancient myths. But now I think it's time to face the question that's been lurking in the shadows this whole time. You're talking about the possibility that some of these creatures from mythology, the vampires, werewolves, sirens, could actually exist.
Right.
We've been dancing around it, but now I'm ready to dive headfirst into the deep end. Is there any evidence, any possibility, that these creatures might be more than just figments of our imagination?
Well, remember the article you shared with us?
Yeah.
The things that go bump in the night? It doesn't shy away from this question.
Okay.
In fact, it argues that there's truth to myths on both a narrative and archetypal level.
Right, and it used the vampire as a prime example, suggesting that the vampire archetype represents the energy rapist, someone who feeds off the life force of others.
Yes.
And if we take that a step further, we can see how that archetype plays out in real-world situations.
Right.
Like the cults and satanic practices the article mentioned, where the taking of someone's energy or essence is a disturbing reality.
Exactly.
Okay, so the darkness depicted in the vampire myth might have some real-world parallels, but does that mean there are literal blood-drinking vampires lurking out there? I have to admit, that's where my skepticism kicks in.
And skepticism is healthy.
Yes.
Especially when dealing with such extraordinary claims. But the article encourages us to balance that skepticism with an open mind.
Okay.
After all, if we dismiss everything we don't immediately understand, we might miss out on potentially profound discoveries.
So how do we approach these claims of real-life vampires? Is it all just elaborate hoaxes and people caught up in fantasies, or could there be something more to it?
The article doesn't offer a definitive answer, and that's perhaps the point.
Okay.
It encourages us to investigate, to question,
Right.
to be both discerning and curious.
Yeah.
It reminds us that the truth is often stranger than fiction.
It also highlights those fascinating connections between vampire lore and actual science, like
Yeah.
how the traditional weaknesses of vampires, garlic and silver, actually have blood-purifying properties.
It's almost as if our ancestors, through observation and experience, stumbled upon practical solutions without fully understanding the scientific mechanisms at play.
Right.
It makes you wonder what other hidden truths might be embedded in these stories, waiting to be uncovered.
Right. Okay, so maybe there's some validity to the vampire myth, but what about other creatures? Werewolves, sirens, dragons. Are they just figments of our imagination, or could they represent something more? I mean, could there actually be a creature out there that transforms under the full moon or lures sailors to their doom with enchanting songs?
Those are some intriguing questions.
Mm-hmm.
And while the article focuses primarily on the vampire myth, it does suggest that many of these creatures might embody deeper truths about human nature and the world around us.
So how do we make sense of all of this? Are
Uh,
you suggesting we should start believing in every mythical creature we've ever heard of?
Not necessarily,
Okay.
but I think the article encourages us to approach these topics with a sense of wonder and a willingness to explore beyond our preconceived notions.
It's like we're being challenged to expand our understanding of reality,
Right.
to consider possibilities that might seem outlandish at first glance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers,
Mm.
that there are still mysteries to be uncovered. And perhaps, as the article suggests, some of those mysteries might be closer to home than we think.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
I agree.
I started out thinking we were going to be talking about spooky stories and ancient legends,
Right.
but it's turned into something much more profound.
It's been an exploration of belief,
Mm.
the nature of reality,
Right.
and the power of stories to shape our understanding of the world.
And you know what? I'm not sure I have any definitive answers, but I feel like I've gained a new perspective, a sense of curiosity and wonder that I didn't have before.
And that, I think, is the true gift of exploring the metaphysical realm.
Yeah.
It invites us to question, to learn, to keep an open mind, and to embrace the mystery that lies at the heart of existence.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. What if those other creatures from mythology, the werewolves, the sirens, the dragons, are more than just fantastical beings? What if they hold hidden truths, warnings, or even clues to unlocking deeper levels of understanding about ourselves and the universe?
Perhaps it's time to dust off those old legends, look beyond the surface, and see what they have to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
The answers might be closer than we think.
Well said. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder those possibilities.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that sense of wonder alive.
Mm-hmm.
The world is full of mysteries, and the journey of discovery is just beginning.